Ladies and gentlemen, I am back. It's been a few weeks since I've done a video. We'll just call that the mid-season hiatus when I was recovering from surgery. I will probably have a vlog stating what I've been up to during the weeks that I haven't been filming videos, but for now, we are going to be doing a collaboration. This was suggested by Danny from DR Ranger, and we also have Lisa Daly, Caro Brown, Audrey Henley, and Z Falk. And I will leave the links to everyone's channel and video down below as soon as they upload so that you can easily find them. And I am going to be talking about anti-heroes in comic books. That's what's coming up in this episode. You're watching The Story Detective. Stick around. So what are anti-heroes? There's a fine line between being an anti-hero and a villain. In fact, to some people they are villains. They can come under the category of Robin Hood type characters, even anarchists, things that would normally raise fear if we heard about them in the news. When I tried to trace anti-heroes back to their origin, the oldest reference I could find was back in 1863 with Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground. And yet, in the late 1880s, Sherlock Holmes, one of my favorite characters, was an anti-hero. Sometimes he would go out there and actually burglarize places to get evidence if it helped someone that he believed was innocent and deserved his help. He would go beyond the law or above the law. And there were a lot of anti-heroes in independent comic books, but looking at the bigger characters from Marvel and DC, there was a progression, and that progression started with a handful of characters and, as well, a handful of writers and artists that brought them to the point where they crossed that line. And we're going to talk a little bit about the history of a few of those characters. Wolverine is a character that we're all familiar with as being very much an anti-hero. In the beginning, comic books were governed by the Comics Code Authority. Supposedly there was no written law for the Comics Code. It was for comic book companies to regulate themselves. Advertisers, parents, they looked for these things to be reassuring that these comic books would be fit for their children. When I was a kid, they were going to rot your brain and they were going to do all kinds of things to influence you that would not be good for your life. They were just unhealthy ideas. In those early X-Men stories, Wolverine was basically a secondary character. He didn't have a very big role except to cause dissension, be disagreeable, and cause conflict between teammates, which showed they weren't a perfect superhero team. They could disagree over decisions. Original creators Dave Cockrum and Len Wein saw him as animalistic and as feisty as his namesake. But if there was a backstory and more to him than that, it was never shown. When artist John Byrne took over the book, he saw Wolverine as a character with a past and deeply flawed. And as someone who wanted to eventually be a writer, he thought this could make for a very interesting character. In fact, he believed that it would bring Wolverine to the forefront and make him a star. It would be years before we learned most of Wolverine's past, but we came to understand that he did a lot of nasty business for the Canadian government. He belonged to a Canadian group of superheroes, another mutant group called Alpha Flight, which was also created by Byrne. The Canadian government wanted Wolverine back. Under John Byrne's penciling and his eventual co-plotting of the book, Wolverine was just as disagreeable, but now he was suddenly interesting to watch. And John also made him dangerous. There was a quote from an interview when he said something like Wolverine would have no compunction about gutting one of his teammates over breakfast and then just turning around like there was nothing at all to it and finish eating his cornflakes. But how do you show that killer inside in a comic book and get past the comic code? It finally happened in a story that was just leading up to the Phoenix Saga, which had few things in common with the recent film, by the way. And there was a group of bad or evil mutants called the Hellfire Club. They had an actual club in Manhattan. They dressed like people who came out of the 1800s, and they had a ranking like chess pieces, like Black King, Black Queen, Black Bishop. They were missing one teammate, which was the Black Queen. and they decided that they were going to manipulate Jean Grey, and she would fill that slot. They put one of the old X-Men villains up to the task. His name was Mastermind, and for good reason. He had mental abilities and could influence people and make them see what he wanted them to see. And with Jean Grey, he made her feel like she was living in that time period in the 1800s and reliving the past of an ancestor of hers who wasn't a very nice person. Opening her up to all of that darkness within would have some pretty serious consequences and lead up to the Dark Phoenix saga. But during this battle, the X-Men are all defeated, except for Wolverine. There was a mutant called Harry Leland, and he could increase the weight or mass of objects. He used his powers on Wolverine and goes plummeting down through the floor and several stories and ends up falling into the storm sewer and getting washed away. The final page of that issue showed Wolverine rising up from the muck with his claws extended, saying, "Now it's my turn." The Uncanny X-Men number 133 was entitled Wolverine Alone, which says pretty much everything. And though the pages weren't drawn with blood splattering all over the place like some comics you would see today, it's pretty clear by the sound of the screams and the red-colored panels what's happening here. A lot of it's left up to the imagination, but we can imagine some pretty serious damage occurring to those guys. And looking at this clip from John Byrne's sketchbook, which didn't see print in the comic, you can see that he wanted, or possibly would have liked to have had, a little bit more blood splattering. For years, fans and creators wanted comic book stories to be more realistic. Violence, when you're sending superheroes or characters into violent situations, eventually somebody's going to get hurt, and there's going to be repercussions. To sugarcoat that all the time isn't really a good thing either. And to have more realistic stories and breaking that mold, here, in mainstream comics especially, a new precedent was being set, and that began to abolish the Comics Code, which would eventually go away sometime in the early 2000s. It also needs to be said that during this time, around the early to mid-80s, a man named Frank Miller was working on Daredevil. Now, Daredevil was not an anti-hero. He was for the law and due process. However, what those books did to help break the Comics Code was bring gang violence and realistic, gritty fight scenes with martial arts and things where characters would get hurt. Characters were shown to be bruised and bleeding. Sometimes the blood would be black instead of red, because I think red blood was one of those things that they couldn't show or didn't want to show. These comic books expressed that there were consequences to violent actions. The Punisher first made his appearance in Amazing Spider-Man number 129 as the villain of the month. He was an assassin hired by another bad guy called the Jackal, who was throwing new threats at Spider-Man every issue. The Punisher continued to make sporadic appearances in Spider-Man comics, including Spider-Man Annual number 15 in 1981, which was maybe not so coincidentally drawn by Frank Miller. In this comic, the Punisher is drugged by Dr. Octopus and forced to do his bidding. Spider-Man eventually defeats him and then leaves him for the police, and at the end of the book, the Punisher is arrested. 5 years go by without any sign of the Punisher at all, until 1986, when writer Stephen Grant and penciler Mike Zeck came up with an idea to give him his own book. Marvel was actually pretty reluctant to make a cold-blooded killer a protagonist, but the creators persisted, and eventually the project was greenlighted, and they were given a 5-issue miniseries. The miniseries struck gold, and suddenly everyone is rooting for the Punisher. A guy who was ex-military, once a police officer, whose family was gunned down in the crossfire of 2 rival gangs. It's interesting how every big successful business person usually has a story to tell that they arrived in their position that they obtained through ignoring conventional rules or wisdom. Yet once they get there, they're reluctant to ignore those rules. The creators who pushed for their project, in doing so, I suppose were anti-heroes in their own right, because it went against the grain of what was then considered acceptable for comic books, especially mainstream comic books. Of course, once the idea was successful, Marvel flooded the market with new Punisher titles. And now that character that they didn't know what to do with, who sat on ice for 5 years, was everywhere. He was suddenly a cash cow. and the comics code began to fragment. Also around this time of the mid to late 80s is when the comic book industry began to boom. Comic shops were opening all over the place, and this gave the industry a new opportunity to launch what they called a direct market sale. These comic books were sold directly to comic shops and were marketed as more for adults. They were supposed to be more sophisticated, branching out into new areas, and graphic novels and those types of stories were introduced. They were printed with cardboard covers, square bound, and instead of newsprint, they were printed on magazine stock. Frank Miller, who was also rising in popularity, submitted an idea for a different kind of Batman story. Batman had always walked a fine line between the white hats and the black, and Frank was determined to explore those shades of gray and expand on them in that area where anti-heroes thrive. And so The Dark Knight Returns was released in 4 issues that were about 50 pages or so, square bound, and they had glossy magazine style pages. Set in the not so distant future, a 50-year-old Bruce Wayne had retired his cape. This was the result of the government, who banned all superhero activity, except for Superman, who they kept on working for them and took orders directly from the president himself. The pages were laid out in a wild mix of words and pictures, displaying a world where corruption in government and news media polluted facts with rhetoric. Crime and violence polluted the streets of Gotham City. Unable to sit idly by any longer, a middle-aged Bruce Wayne decided to don the mask once more, and he started dishing out a gritty array of violence. He faced old villains like Two-Face and the Joker, as well as a street gang called the Mutants who terrorized the city. He also took on a new Robin, this time a young girl by the name of Carrie Kelly, who was inspired by his actions. Of course, the government eventually finds out and sends Superman to warn Batman to stop, then sends him to take Batman down when he doesn't listen. The resulting battle between the two was the inspiration for the recent film Batman vs. Superman. Why are these some of my favorite characters, and why do anti-heroes appeal to so many nice, normal people? First of all, nobody's normal. I've accepted my abnormality long ago, and you would be well off to do the same, because nobody's normal. The people that fight the hardest to present this normal facade, they're not normal. What passes for normal in life, most of it isn't normal. So let's move along. Because what passes for normal is an illusion anyway. In terms of heroes, whether it's comic books or any hero that fights the good fight, they're usually in this philosophy of once they have the villain pinned or cornered, it's that end moment where they're tempted to go beyond just having them arrested or brought to trial. And then they stop themselves and they say, no, if I go any further, I'm no better than you are. And the villain is just grinning and saying, yeah, my attorney's going to tear this case apart and I'll be on the streets again in a week, which they are, hurting more people. But the anti-heroes take it beyond that step. They go to a different place that's a little unpredictable. They put the villain in the place of their victims. We have villains that have been mass murderers or hurt a lot of people in other ways, and they know they're going to be out of jail and doing the same thing again. Putting them in the place of their victim, in spite of their threats or sometimes their pleas, it doesn't mean a thing to this type of character. There's something about that that's satisfying and kind of therapeutic at the same time. So what about the creators? The creators that did this were also fighting their giants. They were professionals. They didn't ignore the rules. They learned them. And probably, like most of us, working in the trenches is an education. But it's a hard education because you think once you get your foot in the door, you're going to meet other creative people who are going to be more accepting of your ideas and you. But a lot of them aren't. And they still have things that are blocking you and the gatekeepers. So these guys pushed the extra mile. They went to bat for their ideas in spite of everyone they know, including fellow creators or their editors or the companies they work for, saying this is going to be a tough sell, this isn't going to work, and prove them wrong. And there's also something satisfying about that because after all their hard work, they've managed to come back to themselves, to use those rules and the things they've learned to their own benefit, and take it to the type of place that they wanted to go. So the next time you read these comics, or even watch movies with anti-heroes, remember that there's somebody behind that that's working out their own angst, or potentially coming up against those giants. And they're coming up against them in a way that says, symbolically, I'm not going to follow the rules here. I'm going to do it my way. If it's a success, then of course every naysayer out there will accept it. And that's something to think about as well, because life is a creative canvas. Whether you're an artist or a writer or just trying to figure out life, we're all trying to find our own way. If you like this video, go watch the other videos that's in this collaboration. And I also hope that you'll subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss my future uploads. And until next time, keep creating. Don't give up on your dream. Ask yourself, what's the next level that you could take your characters to? What's the next level you could take the genre that you're creating into? Because you may be the next pioneer who influences the next level of books and movies. You are the next generation of creators. You are you, and don't be afraid to let your passion shine. So keep those keyboards clacking until we meet in the next exciting episode of The Story Detective.